Hello, welcome to the channel. Subscribe, leave a like, and don't forget to write a comment. Enjoy watching.
My sister rear-ended a semi with my car, blamed me for letting her drive it drunk, and my parents believed her without even asking me what happened. That's when I stopped being the nice one. It was the kind of Thursday that slips through your fingers like lukewarm coffee. Nothing special, nothing offensive. I was halfway through sorting receipts at my kitchen table when my phone rang with that half-choked sob of someone trying to sound like the victim. It was Hannah, my younger sister by exactly 16 months and 6 days, crying that she had just gotten into an accident and didn't know what to do. She kept repeating, "I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to, I messed up." And at first I thought she'd hit a mailbox or maybe backed into someone's car in a parking lot. But when she finally sobbed, "It was your car," my stomach twisted like it had been yanked by a fishhook. I drove to Riverside and Elm, took me 11 minutes, where I found my white Honda Civic crushed in the front, half its bumper dangling off, and parked sideways into the back end of a semi-truck. The truck's rear fender was folded like paper, and the driver stood beside it with his arms crossed, expression unreadable, like he was waiting for someone to finally make sense of the whole thing. Hannah stood next to my car, arms wrapped tightly around herself, mascara streaked like she'd practiced crying in a mirror. I asked if anyone was hurt. The truck driver said no. I looked at Hannah, who was trembling, her voice soft and brittle. "I just looked down for a second," she said. And the next thing, she gestured helplessly at the wreck. She didn't say she was sorry again. I was still trying to keep it together, still trying to figure out how to process it, how to forgive her, how to navigate the insurance, how to explain to my job why I might not have a car for a while. When our parents pulled up, they weren't supposed to be there. I hadn't called them, but there they were, Mom in her beige coat that made her look like she was always heading to a funeral, and Dad in his business casual weekend wear, both stepping out of their SUV with their eyes already filled with worry. Before I could wave or speak, Hannah ran toward them like a war orphan, arms flung wide, sobbing as she said, "I shouldn't have taken it, but Maya said it was okay. I told her I'd been drinking. She still said yes." Everything froze. It felt like I dropped through the floor into a different version of reality. My mom pulled her close immediately, comforting her like some tragic little victim, while Dad's face shifted slowly into something more severe, something half disbelief, half shame. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. I looked at them, at all three of them, trying to blink the accusation off my skin, but it just pantar. My mother didn't even look at me. My dad said, "Is that true?" in a tone I didn't recognize. I shook my head slowly, and I think I said no, but it didn't sound like a protest. It sounded like something a guilty person would say. The truck driver stood there the whole time, arms still crossed, watching. Maybe it was pity in his eyes, or maybe it was recognition. Either way, I felt exposed. On the ride home, nobody spoke to me. I drove the family car. Hannah sat in the back with Mom, who kept whispering to her like I wasn't 2 feet away. And Dad kept tapping his fingers on the steering wheel like he couldn't stop thinking about what I had allowed to happen. The silence screamed louder than any shouting ever could. That night, I sat on my back porch with a blanket wrapped around my legs, the breeze cutting into my skin, just enough to keep me grounded. I hadn't cried, not once. I felt something worse than sadness. It was the feeling you get when you realize you've been categorized, filed away into the wrong drawer by the people who should know you best. They saw me as someone who let her little sister drive drunk, a reckless, selfish liability. I was the older one, the responsible one, and they had discarded all of that in seconds. All it took was Hannah sobbing in her fake sincere voice. My phone buzzed. A number I didn't recognize. I stared at it for a while before answering. It was the truck driver. His voice was calm. "Just wanted to check, are you okay?" I didn't know how to answer that question. I said, "I'm fine." There was a pause, and then he said, "I got a dash cam. It caught the whole thing." She looked down at her phone, never touched the brake. I closed my eyes. "Would you be willing to talk?" Another pause. Then he said, "Yeah, let's talk." I ended the call, set the phone down, and for the first time in hours, I smiled. Not because I was happy, but because I finally had a piece of the truth. My sister may have played her hand early, but I wasn't done playing. Not even close. I met Tom the next day at a diner just outside town, the kind of place where the booths creak when you sit down. The coffee tastes like burned hope, and the waitress knows the regulars by the kind of pie they order, not their names. I had texted him earlier that morning, after barely sleeping, pacing a rut into my bedroom carpet, while my mind tried to stack and restack the same facts into some version that made emotional sense. He agreed to meet without hesitation, just said, 10 o'clock, Marty's off 47, I'll be the one in flannel. When I walked in, he was already there, sitting alone by the window, staring out at the parking lot with a half-empty cup of coffee in front of him, and the kind of stillness that only comes from a person who's seen enough not to be easily surprised anymore. He looked up as I approached, gave me a nod that wasn't friendly or cold, just factual, like he had already decided this meeting would matter, but hadn't yet chosen if that was good or bad. I didn't tell your parents anything, he said, before I even sat down. Didn't seem like it would help. I nodded slowly, slid into the seat across from him, and wrapped my hands around the cup the waitress had just placed down for me, grateful for something warm even if I had no intention of drinking it. I appreciate that, I said, and I meant it, more than I thought I would. I don't think they would have listened anyway. He studied me for a long second before he spoke again, voice low and calm, like someone delivering a weather report about a storm already overhead. Your sister lied to them. That much was clear. Girl came out of that car looking guilty before she even opened her mouth. She does that, I said. Gets ahead of the truth. Makes you feel like the bad guy just for asking a question. He looked down into his coffee, then back up. You want to set the record straight, or you want to teach her a lesson? It was the first time anyone had asked me that so directly, without judgment, without that layered insinuation that I might be taking things too far just by wanting to defend myself. I sat with the question for a moment, rolling it around in my brain like a marble in a bowl, because it wasn't that simple. I didn't just want to clear my name. I didn't want to scream, "I told you so," from the rooftop. I wanted to pull the curtain back on Hannah's entire act and make everyone in our family see her the way I did. Not as the misunderstood baby sister who made mistakes, but as the manipulator she was becoming, one soft lie at a time. Both, I said finally, and he nodded like he already knew that's what I'd say. Over the next hour, we laid out what he remembered, every second of the accident from the moment he saw her car approaching too fast in his rear view to the second she stepped out of the vehicle, clutching her phone like it might rewrite the past if she just held it tightly enough. He had a dash cam. He hadn't even watched it yet, he said, because it was clear enough without it. But he offered to send me the footage, and I agreed. Then we talked about options. What might happen if we went to the police? What insurance would say? Whether my parents would even believe cold video evidence after swallowing Hannah's performance so easily. And that's when I realized the truth wasn't enough, not on its own. What I needed was proof delivered in such a way that it couldn't be spun, couldn't be softened or ignored, couldn't be tucked away under a pile of good intentions and sibling loyalty. Tom leaned in, voice lowering like we were planning a heist, which in some small, emotional way, we were. You want me to talk to them? He asked. Straightforward, calm. Maybe they listened to a stranger. I shook my head. No, not yet. They'll just think you're lying for me. He smiled a little at that. Just a flicker and nodded. Then what? I want her to feel watched, I said. Not scared, just seen. Like someone knows the truth, even if no one's saying it out loud. He raised an eyebrow, thoughtful. You're talking long game. Yeah, I said, and this time I didn't smile either. The kind where she teaches herself the lesson. That night, I got the dash cam footage, and I didn't even have to open it. Just knowing it was there gave me back a kind of control I hadn't realized I'd lost until Hannah took it. I didn't need to shove it in their faces. Not yet. Let the facts simmer. Let her walk around with the suspicion that maybe she hadn't covered her tracks as well as she thought. The next day, I called in a noise complaint to the sheriff's office. Nothing serious, just a tip about someone possibly driving under the influence near the neighborhood. Gave them a street, vague description of the car. Used a burner app. That evening, I stood at the window, watched as a patrol car slowed as it passed our house, and noticed how Hannah peeked through the blinds with a look that wasn't exactly fear, but it wasn't comfort either. Then around midnight, I got a photo text from Tom. It was blurry, grainy, probably shot from inside his truck, but there was no mistaking the subject. Hannah walking out of her job in the mall parking lot, looking over her shoulder, phone clutched to her ear, and, most telling, eyes darting like someone who wasn't sure who might be behind her. Below the photo, one text. She knows. I didn't reply. I just stared at the screen for a long time, then put the phone down on the table beside me, leaned back, and let the quiet settle in my chest. I wasn't sure what would happen next, but for the first time since she turned my parents against me with nothing more than fake tears and half a sentence, I wasn't the one on the defensive anymore, and neither was she. The next week unfolded with a strange kind of rhythm, like the steady ticking of a clock right before it strikes something you've been dreading or hoping for, depending on which side of the lie you're standing on. Hannah started behaving differently, subtle changes at first, the kind that most people wouldn't notice unless they were watching closely, but I was watching more closely than I ever had before, not out of bitterness or paranoia, but because I had finally accepted something about her that I'd been denying for years. She had learned how to weaponize innocence, and she'd become frighteningly good at it. She stopped leaving her phone unattended, even when she was just stepping into the other room. She started double-checking if anyone was home before she made a phone call. She asked more questions about where I was going and when I'd be back, acting like she suddenly cared about my schedule, as if pretending to be the concerned sister might cover the frayed edges of her nerves. I didn't call her out, didn't corner her, didn't even look at her too long. I just let the silence between us grow denser, more electric, until even Mom started asking if everything was okay. I told her I was fine, of course, and she accepted it the way she always accepted things from me, like I was made of logic and stability, and didn't need much attention. That's the problem with being the dependable one. People don't see you unraveling until you've already come apart. But this wasn't unraveling. This was something colder, something more calculated. And for the first time in my life, I didn't care if it made me look harsh or heartless. My sister had thrown me under the bus, watched our parents believe it without blinking, and walked away clean. She hadn't just betrayed me. She had rewritten reality and let me live in the version where I was guilty. Tom and I met again at Marty's on a Tuesday morning, and this time, it didn't feel like a conversation, it felt like a briefing. He had gone out of his way to do a little digging, and it turned out he wasn't just some guy with a dash cam and a good memory. He had friends, retired state troopers, one of whom now ran private surveillance for insurance companies. He wasn't suggesting anything illegal, not even close, but he did ask if I'd be interested in having someone keep an eye on Hannah for a few days, just to collect patterns, as he put it. And I didn't hesitate before saying yes. What I wanted wasn't scandal or chaos. I wasn't looking to destroy her. I just needed enough to create a crack in the perfect little narrative she'd built. A single undeniable truth that would sit in front of my parents like an uninvited guest they couldn't ignore. I knew how Hannah operated. She would never admit to anything unless forced, and she was always 3 steps ahead when it came to spinning a story. What she didn't count on was that I had finally stopped trying to protect her from the consequences of her own choices. A week later, Tom handed me a flash drive. "I think you'll like this," he said, and I could tell by the tightness in his jaw that there was more weight in that sentence than he was letting on. At home, alone, I plugged it into my laptop and watched. It was simple footage, nothing dramatic. No wild confrontations, no drunken rants, just a quiet, consistent pattern of carelessness. Hannah driving home after drinks with friends, 1 glass too many to be safe. Her friends laughing in the car, one of them asking, "Are you okay to drive?" And her brushing it off with, "I do this all the time." Her phone in her hand, glowing at her thigh, as she rolled through stop signs. The kind of video that didn't show disaster, but showed its probability. And then there was the audio. Tom had managed to record a conversation, picked up from her friend's dash cam during a mall parking lot drop-off. The friend said, laughing, "You ever think Maya's gonna figure out you totally blame that crash on her?" And Hannah, without missing a beat, replied, "Even if she did, no one would believe her. She's too quiet. She never fights back." That single sentence was like a match across dry grass. I sat there, laptop screen casting blue light across my face, and I felt a calm I hadn't felt in days. Not because it hurt less, but because the shape of the truth was finally whole in my hands, and it was ugly and plain and undeniable. I didn't show my parents the video immediately. That would have been too easy, and too easy wouldn't change anything, not really. I needed them to feel the tension before they saw the proof, to question their own trust in her before I presented the reality they had chosen to ignore. So I started small. I asked Dad what the insurance agent had said, and he mentioned that they'd already written it off as a tragic mistake involving alcohol, which meant Hannah had doubled down on her story, even after the incident. I nodded and said, "You know, it's funny because she never drinks around me. Then let the silence speak louder than any accusation." Later that night, I left an envelope on Dad's desk. Inside, a still frame from the footage. Hannah behind the wheel, clearly mid-sentence, clearly not sober, clearly holding her phone. I didn't include a note. I wanted the image to burn itself into his conscience without the distraction of words. 2 days later, Mom confronted me in the laundry room of all places, holding the printed photo in her hand like it was radioactive. "Where did you get this?" she asked, voice tight with confusion and fear, not anger. I just said, "From someone who saw what happened and didn't lie about it." She didn't ask anything else, just walked out, and I could hear her heels clicking down the hallway, like the sound of a verdict being carried to a courtroom. The next evening, Hannah seemed rattled. She was quieter, jumped a little when the doorbell rang, and stared at her phone like she expected something, or someone, to come through it. And that was exactly what I wanted. She wasn't confessing yet, but she was unraveling in her own way. And all I had to do now was set the table and wait for the right moment to serve the truth. Dinner was coming, and I had every intention of inviting a very specific guest. The day I invited everyone to dinner, it wasn't some symbolic gesture wrapped in forgiveness or an olive branch masked as a casserole. It was strategic, deliberately orchestrated, a performance dressed as a family gathering, and every element of it was selected with the kind of precision you only learn after you've been burned badly enough to stop caring whether people think you're kind and start caring whether they finally see the truth. I told Mom I wanted to make dinner for everyone, something comforting, something normal, because I was tired of the tension, and she latched onto that excuse like it was a life preserver. She was so eager to believe I wanted peace, so desperate to smooth the cracks that had formed across our family's carefully curated image, that she didn't question the timing, the tone, or the undercurrent. She just said, "That sounds like a lovely idea," and started texting Hannah to confirm. What I didn't tell her, of course, was that I had already invited someone else, someone who wasn't family but had become a witness to the unraveling of ours. Tom agreed without hesitation, and even though I could hear the uncertainty in his voice when I explained what I wanted to do, he didn't try to talk me out of it. He just said, "If you're sure, I'll be there," and I was. I had spent weeks gathering truths that should have been obvious, watching my sister squirm beneath the surface, while my parents clung to the illusion that she was simply troubled, misunderstood, maybe a little reckless, but never malicious. And now, with all the pieces laid out, it was time to hand them the full picture and let them decide what they wanted to see. Dinner itself was ordinary on the surface. Roast chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans with too much garlic because that's how Dad likes them. And I played the part of the dutiful daughter, setting the table with quiet efficiency, refilling wine glasses without prompting, even smiling when Hannah walked through the door wearing a dress I hadn't seen since last Christmas, as if dressing up could somehow insulate her from what was about to happen. She looked around the room, took in the table settings, the food, the soft music playing from the kitchen speaker, and for a moment I could see her trying to decide if this was a trap or a truce. But then she spotted Tom, sitting quietly at the far end of the table, and all the color drained from her face like someone had turned her inside out. She didn't speak right away, just froze in place, eyes locked on his, and then glanced at me with something that wasn't quite fear, but was definitely a step past unease. I smiled, not warmly, but not cruelly either, and gestured to the empty seat next to her. "Sit," I said, and my tone was casual enough that Mom didn't pick up on the tension, or maybe she did and chose to ignore it. That had become her specialty, ignoring the things that didn't fit her version of reality. For the first 20 minutes, we ate in relative silence, broken only by the occasional clink of silverware or a polite comment about the meal. Tom said nothing, kept his eyes on his plate, while Hannah picked at her food like it might bite her if she got too close. Dad was the one who finally broke the silence, asking Tom what he did for a living, and Tom answered with practiced ease, explaining his route schedule, how he'd been driving for 20 years, how he liked the solitude. And then, without looking up, he added, "Of course it gets complicated when people rear-end you out of nowhere. That kind of shakes your trust." Hannah choked slightly on her wine, and Mom shot her a concerned glance, but said nothing. I waited a beat, then stood, walked to the sideboard, and returned with a small black device, a portable speaker, placing it in the center of the table like a centerpiece made of dynamite. "There's something I think you should all hear," I said, and pressed play before anyone could object. The audio was clear, painfully so, and filled the room with the voices of Hannah and her friend, laughing as they recounted the night of the crash, making light of it, bragging about how she had flipped it to make me look like the bad guy. Her words, not mine. "Even if Maya figures it out," her voice said, tinny but unmistakable, "no one's gonna believe her. She's too good, too boring, too safe. I made one mistake, and she'll carry it for me. She always does." The silence that followed was different from the one we started with. It wasn't awkward or strained. It was broken. Dad's fork clattered against his plate. Mom blinked twice, then looked at me with eyes that finally held something like understanding. And Hannah, she didn't speak, didn't apologize, just sat there, mouth slightly open, fingers gripping the edge of her chair like she was preparing for a storm she thought she'd outrun. Tom didn't gloat, didn't add commentary. He simply looked at her and said, "I've seen a lot of lies on the road. Most don't sit down at your dinner table." It was Dad who stood first, walking out of the room without a word, leaving his half-finished plate behind. Mom looked like she wanted to follow but didn't, frozen between her two daughters, unsure of who needed defending now that the truth had landed like a sledgehammer in the middle of our carefully choreographed dysfunction. I expected Hannah to cry, to deny, to scream about betrayal or injustice, or how we had twisted her words, but she did none of that. She just sat there, rigid and stunned, as if realizing that the safety net she had always counted on had vanished while she wasn't looking. I cleared the dishes in silence one by one, while she remained rooted in place, and Tom helped me without asking. When we finished, he patted my shoulder once, gently, and left without saying goodbye. It wasn't necessary. His part was done. That night, I didn't sleep. Not because I was upset or anxious, but because I couldn't stop replaying the moment her voice filled the room, that undeniable proof hanging in the air like smoke after a fire. She had counted on silence, on my silence, and now she didn't have that anymore. And still, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Because people like Hannah don't collapse after exposure. They adapt, they pivot. And if I knew my sister, and I did, then this wasn't her end. It was just the moment she stopped pretending. The days following that dinner felt like they belonged to someone else's life, or maybe like I had stepped into a version of mine that had been stretched and thinned out into something almost unrecognizable, where every glance held more weight and every silence seemed heavy with things no one wanted to say out loud. Hannah stayed mostly in her room, barely speaking to anyone, as if isolating herself would somehow allow the smoke to clear faster. while Mom floated around the house with the forced cheerfulness of someone trying to patch a sinking boat with paper towels. Dad didn't speak much to either of us, and when he did, it was the kind of clipped, tired communication that made it clear he hadn't processed anything so much as locked it into a box. He wasn't quite ready to open yet. I should have felt triumphant. I had exposed the truth, revealed the lie, and shown them exactly who had manipulated whom, but the victory wasn't clean, and it certainly wasn't satisfying. There was no apology, no tearful reunion, no family-wide reckoning that tied everything up with a neat, redemptive bow. There was just space, more of it than before, and in that space, 1,000 questions that none of us wanted to be the first to ask. Tom and I spoke once more briefly. He called a few days after the dinner, not to rehash anything or gloat, but just to check in, like he understood instinctively that the moments after a confrontation are often lonelier than the lead-up. "You got what you needed," he said, his voice calm as always. "Now you gotta figure out what you want." I didn't answer, not because I didn't have thoughts, but because I hadn't sorted through them enough to put them into words. He didn't press. He just wished me well, and I knew that would be the last time we spoke. His role in the story was over, and he had been a stranger kind enough to help someone else out of a hole they hadn't dug themselves but had been buried in just the same. Then, a week later, after the tension had curdled into something quieter but still very much present, I decided to do something no one expected. I planned another dinner. Not for redemption this time, and not even for closure, but because I wanted to see, just one more time, how much everyone was willing to pretend. I cooked the same meal, set the same table, and extended the same invitation to Mom, Dad, and Hannah. This time with one addition, someone no one else knew was coming. The moment Hannah walked into the dining room, she froze. Not because of the food or the music or the scent of garlic on the air, but because seated at the end of the table beside Mom's usual spot was someone she hadn't seen in over a year. Alex, her ex-boyfriend, the one she had dated for nearly a year before things went sour in ways no one ever really explained. He stood when she walked in, smiled like someone meeting an old friend rather than a person with unfinished business, and said, "Long time, Hannah." Her face drained of color so fast it almost looked theatrical, and I could feel the entire energy in the room shift as Mom turned toward me, confused, and Dad sat up straighter, clearly sensing something was off, but not yet sure how. What no one else in the room knew, at least not until that moment, was that Alex had a connection to Tom. His sister had dated Tom years ago, and when I found that out through one of Tom's offhand comments, I knew the universe was handing me a final piece of leverage I hadn't even known I needed. The dinner was polite, at least on the surface. We made small talk, we passed dishes. Alex told a harmless story about a road trip gone wrong, but beneath it all, there was a tension that made every bite taste like it might come back up. Hannah barely spoke, barely ate, and every time Alex looked at her, she flinched slightly, as if remembering something she couldn't quite control. I didn't press. I didn't need to. This wasn't about revenge anymore. This was about balance. She had spent so long orchestrating narratives, so long playing puppeteer with people's perceptions, that sitting across from two people who now saw her without the filter of her charm was more effective than any confrontation. After the meal, as people started gathering their things and murmuring excuses to head home, Hannah pulled me aside in the hallway. Her voice was quiet, brittle, not broken, but barely held together. "Why him?" she asked. Not angrily, not even with venom, but with something closer to confusion, as if she truly couldn't understand how I had gone from the sister who kept her secrets to the one who had turned them into weapons. I looked her in the eye, saw every version of our childhood play across her expression. The fights, the apologies, the endless cycle of her mistakes and my forgiveness, and I said, "Because you taught me how to lie with a smile," and I finally decided to stop smiling. She didn't respond, just nodded once, and walked past me like a ghost who finally realized she was being haunted by someone else for a change. I don't know what she'll do next. Maybe she'll change. Maybe she'll retaliate. Maybe she'll fold into herself and emerge something better or worse or simply more guarded. But I know one thing. The illusion has been shattered, and the silence she once counted on has become something that now stands against her. As for me, I didn't feel victorious. I felt neutral, like I had cleaned a wound, not healed it. Like the worst part wasn't over, but the pretending was, and that was something. There are still unanswered questions. Why did she lie so easily? Why did they believe her so quickly? Why did I let it go for so long? But maybe those aren't the kinds of questions that get answered. Maybe the truth is that some families only function when the lies are held in place, and when you remove them, the whole thing doesn't fall apart. It just sits there, exposed, waiting for someone to finally acknowledge what's been rotting underneath. And sometimes, just knowing you're no longer the only one who sees it is enough.